This is the third part of the lecture. In the first two parts, we covered Freud and 19th century cultural evolutionism, Freud's estimation of his publication Totem and Taboo, Freud's anthropology and his psychological theory, and then we covered these three principles that are always important to keep in mind when understanding Freud, but especially in understanding Freud's anthropological writings, the complemental series, Lamarckian theory, and Freud's use of the biogenetic law, that is, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, the idea that individual development, ontogeny, recapitulates the evolutionary history of the species. That becomes particularly important because Freud's use of the analogy or the constant reference to analogs between individual development and evolutionary events. So we covered that, and then in the last lecture we got through a discussion of Totem and Taboo, the first three chapters, including the horror of incest, taboo and emotional ambivalence, and then the third chapter, animism, magic, and omnipotence of thought. And tonight, what I'd like to get through is the last chapter of Totem and Taboo, and then discuss the significance of it. So we'll begin with that, and we'll begin with Darwin and the Primal Horde, and discuss Charles Darwin just a little bit before we get into the chapter. Darwin's hypothesis that the primal horde was the original social structure of the human species was arguably the foundation upon which Freud built his reconstruction of the origins of civilization. In this chapter, Freud acknowledges, chapter 4 of Totem and Taboo, Freud acknowledges that the central thesis of Totem and Taboo is, quote, based upon an hypothesis of Charles Darwin's, upon the social state of primitive men, who originally lived in comparatively small groups or hordes, within which the jealousy of the oldest and strongest male prevented sexual promiscuity. Therefore, if we look, this is Freud continuing, therefore, if we look far enough back into the stream of time, the most probable view is that primeval man aboriginally lived in small communities, each with as many wives as he could support and obtain, whom he would have jealously guarded against all other men. Actually, that whole quote is from Darwin, but that's a quote from Darwin in Totem and Taboo, upon which Freud bases his hypothesis. Okay, so Totem and Taboo, Chapter 4, The Return of Totemism in Childhood. This Chapter 4 of Totem and Taboo is the anthropological equivalent of Freud's famous theoretical Chapter 7 in the Interpretation of Dreams, where Freud explained the psychology of dream processes and the wish fulfillment nature of dreams. Here, in this final part of Totem and Taboo, he lays out the social psychology of the process of civilization, which, like a collective dream, also becomes the vehicle for the management and sublimation of wishes. To give a sense for the importance of this chapter in all of Freud's anthropological thinking, this is really, I think, the central chapter. Freud writes, quote, "The whole course of the history of civilization is no more than an account of the various methods adopted by mankind for binding their unsatisfied wishes. This is actually a quote of his from the Claims of Psychoanalysis to the Interest of the Non-Psychological Sciences, also in 1913, the same year of Totem and Taboo. The wishes that require binding will correspond to the dual instincts of Freud's later formulations in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, Sex and Aggression, Eros and Thanatos. Here they show up in the form of the two essential totemic prohibitions against killing the totem and then sex within the clan, or incest. Freud documents the similarities between children and primitives in their manner of relating to animals. Psychoanalyses of children with animal phobias reveal an underlying ambivalence displaced away from the parent onto the animal. This same ambivalence operates in the relation of primitives toward their animal totems. These correspondences illuminate the common dynamics underlying the two systems of psychoneurosis and totemism. Here's Freud, quote, "If the totem animal is the father, then the two principal ordinances of totemism, the two taboo prohibitions, which constitute its core, not to kill the totem and not to have sexual relations with a woman of the same totem, coincide in their content with the two crimes of Oedipus, who killed his father and married his mother, as well as with the two primal wishes of children," end quote. Freud agrees with Tyler and Fraser that the original totems were animals, which can be eaten, and he posits that these animal totems were the primeval substitutes for the jealous father of the original Primal Horde. Freud turns to Scottish poet, novelist, literary critic Andrew Lang. I mentioned these different talents of Andrew Lang, for example, who was one of the notable 19th century cultural evolutionists, just to give people a sense again for the fact that many of the people who are writing in the 19th century and are considered to be important figures in ethnography and social cultural anthropology were from a variety of fields, and generally collecting the data that they were getting from travelers, missionaries, traders, who were bringing back information about primitive tribes and formulating theories about it. So we have Andrew Lang, who is a Scottish poet, a novelist, and a literary critic, who is describing the primal rule instituted by the primal father. And Freud is borrowing Andrew Lang's concept here. Quote, "If it be granted that exogamy existed in practice on the lines of Mr. Darwin's theory, before the totem beliefs lent to the practice a sacred sanction, then the first practical rule would be that of the jealous sire, quote, 'No males to touch the females in my camp,' end quote, with expulsion of adolescent sons." Freud then introduces his psychodynamic explanation of totemism. The origin of the elaborate system of totemic ritual taboos is analogous to the origin of a neurosis. Both go back to the unacceptable wishes of the Oedipus complex. Quote, "The Oedipus complex, the insufficient repression or the reawakening of which forms the nucleus of perhaps every psychoneurosis. In other words, it would enable us," this is Freud, "to make it probable that the totemic system, like little Hans's animal phobia and little Arpad's poultry perversion — we didn't get into this other case of child phobia, we just didn't have enough time, but it's a fascinating case — was a product of the conditions involved in the Oedipus complex." End quote. Freud turns then to William Robertson Smith, who himself was an anthropologist, orientalist, and a minister, whose well-known hypothesis on the festival of the totemic sacrificial meal and lectures on the religion of the Semites in 1889 will play an important role in Freud's reconstruction. So he quotes William Robertson Smith. It was in fact the ancient totem animal, the primitive god himself, by the killing and consuming of which the clansmen renewed their assured their likeness to the god. Quote, that's William Robertson Smith, and then here's Freud. Accordingly, I propose that we should adopt Robertson Smith's hypothesis that the sacramental killing and communal eating of the totem animal, whose consumption was forbidden on all other occasions, was an important feature of totemic religion, end quote. So taken together with the two prohibited wishes of patricide and incest, these elements of Freud's arguments lay the foundations of his reconstruction that is the centerpiece of Totem and Taboo, the elements of which include the original murder and cannibalism of the primal father by the brothers of the Primal Horde, a taking for themselves of his jealously guarded wives, the subsequent remorse and social contract leading to totemic anxiety, or totemic exogamy, ceremonial reenactment of the deed over ages displaced onto the totemic substitute, primal repression of that history that shows up in the form of the incest taboo of these origins, which is really a kind of biological repression in terms of Freud's theory of repression. And then structuring in the form of memory traces of these events into our genetic endowment by means of Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics. And so with these elements in mind, here's Freud's vivid account of the primal deed within the Primal Horde. Quote, if we now bring together the psychoanalytic translation of the totem with the fact of the totem meal and with Darwin's theories of the earliest state of human society, the possibility of a deeper understanding emerges. One day the brothers who had been driven out came together, killed and devoured their father, and so made an end of the patriarchal horde. Cannibal savages as they were, it goes without saying that they devoured their victim as well as killing him. The violent primal father had doubtless been the feared and envied model of each one of the company of brothers. And in the act of devouring him, they accomplished their identification with him. And each one of them acquired a portion of his strength. The totem meal, which is perhaps mankind's earliest festival, would thus be a repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. They thus created out of their filial sense of guilt, this is the brothers of the Primal Horde, the two fundamental taboos of totemism, which for that very reason inevitably corresponded to the two repressed wishes of the Oedipus complex, end quote. So this most controversial reconstruction provides the evolutionary prototype of the resolution of the Oedipus complex of individual development. And it will play a role in Freud's elaboration of his structural theory in the ego and the id, where he lays out his theory of the superego. Notice also how it's not the dual Oedipal wishes that come from the primal events. They were already there. But rather the creation of the conditions for the repression and resolution by means of which, or by means of an identification with the Father. Let me just read that again, because this is somewhat complex. That it's not the dual Oedipal wishes, the two drives of incest and murder, or aggression, sex and aggression, that come from the primal events. They were already there, but rather the creation of the conditions for their repression and resolution by means of an identification with the father. If it will take Freud 10 more years to claim that the superego of individual development is heir to the Oedipus complex, it's here in Totem and Taboo that he confidently declares that the Oedipus complex itself is heir to the primal events and is the universal prime mover of civilization. And so here's Freud on that. At the conclusion, then, of this exceedingly condensed inquiry, I should like to insist that its outcome shows that the beginnings of religion, morals, society, and art converge in the Oedipus complex. This is in complete agreement with the psychoanalytic finding that the same complex constitutes the nucleus of all neuroses, so far as our present knowledge goes. It seems to me, Freud says, a most surprising discovery that the problems of social psychology, too, should prove soluble on the basis of one single concrete point. Okay. Now, to conclude and to elaborate a bit in the form of a discussion on that. As we have seen, Freud's anthropological theory plays a role in the discovery, the clarification, or the working out of all of the following psychological concepts. First, his concepts of projection, the omnipotence of thoughts, and neurosis itself are all seen to be atavistic survivals of traits belonging to man's prehistoric ancestors. Atavisms, this is the tendency of biological forms to revert to their ancestral type. Traits that disappear phenotypically, that is, in terms of the genetic expression in terms of the form of the individual, don't necessarily disappear from an organism's DNA. They show up again. That's an atavism. His theory of castration anxiety, these symptoms in child animal phobias are linked up with guilt and fear of retaliation from the father of the primal horde. His ideas on acting out in psychoanalytic technique and psychotherapy as a defense against remembering repressed traumatic experience. These are both central to Totem and Taboo and Moses and monotheism. His postulation that the phases of psychoneurosis, the libidinal phases of development, and the psychosexual stages of sexual development are recapitulations of analogous events in human evolutionary history. So his exposition in later writings of the phases of psychoneurosis, the libidinal phases of development, and the psychosexual stages of development, he'll return over and over again to the concepts he works out and develops in Totem and Taboo in his exposition of those fundamental psychoanalytic Freudian concepts. His differentiation of various kinds of repression, which include this biological, innate, instinctual biological forgetting, differentiating that from repression proper, which is a dynamic repression that occurs in the case of development. His working out of the structural theory, id, ego, and superego, especially his clarification of the ego ideal and the superego, as these represent precipitates of evolutionary events, structured into our biological heritage in the form of survivals, showing up in the form of survivals with their origins in the circumstances of the primal horde. And then finally, his theory on the internalization of aggression in individual psychology, where he regards the evolutionary history of civilization as being, quote, no more than an account of the various methods adopted by mankind for binding their unsatisfied wishes, not just sexual, but also aggressive. That list is meant to be more of a sampling than an exhaustive list. Regarding its central thesis, Totem and Taboo did for totemism in primitive society what studies in hysteria in 1895 did for the symptoms of hysterical patients, and what the interpretation of dreams in 1900 did for dreamers, I guess would be a good way to put it. It approached its subject scientifically, argued for its functional nature, and made sense out of what seems senseless. But by 1913, Totem and Taboo was far from the first scientifically oriented study of totemism. So if this had been its only claim to virtue, it could easily have been ignored. Also, if Freud's Lamarckian and biogenetic assumptions were wrong, they were certainly never even at the center of controversies that followed, which, as we'll see, the central thesis of Totem and Taboo doesn't even really depend upon them. I want to get into this in just a second. Rather, Totem and Taboo remains to this day both influential and controversial for three reasons taken together. First, this is my own proposition in terms of why Freud's Totem and Taboo remains so influential and controversial to this day. First, it was the first full-fledged scientific integration of biology and psychodynamic psychology. It proposed a unified explanation of the origins and functions of all civilization, no less. And at the same time, it posited universal biopsychological explanatory factors for this, most importantly, but not solely, the Oedipus complex. Freud's major assault on ethnology, considering the far-reaching claims Freud made for explaining social cultural phenomena, and beyond this, the evolution of the human species, it's easy to understand how the discipline of anthropology would have considered Totem and Taboo to be the assault that Freud intended it to be. It became the foundation for all of Freud's later claims that the social sciences are essentially subordinate to his psychoanalytic psychology. For example, he writes in Group Psychology in 1921, so from the very first, individual psychology is at the same time social psychology as well. And then in New Introductory Lectures in 1933, he writes, for sociology too, and we could insert here anthropology, dealing as it does with the behavior of people in society cannot be anything but applied psychology. Strictly speaking, there are only two sciences, psychology, pure and applied, and natural science. You can well understand how anthropology would have had a problem with that, considering that at this time anthropology, at the time of the publication of Totem and Taboo, anthropology, particularly in the United States, was in its own political polemics and establishing itself as a legitimate, autonomous, and important academic profession. Freud essentially subordinates these disciplines and their explanatory insights to psychoanalytic psychology, which he hoped to establish as a social science in its own right. He did this by essentially basing all socio-cultural objects of investigation upon his biological psychodynamic foundations. The response from anthropology was somewhat predictable. Here is Morris Okhla, an early anthropologist who wrote several well-known papers in the 1930s on anthropology and psychoanalysis. Quote, Now, this cultural factor is the chief concern and object of study of the anthropologist, and he is adverse, naturally, to seeing it disqualified at the outset. He is then further disturbed to see the totality of culture explained as a sublimation, as a channelization of the repressed elements of the Oedipus complex into more acceptable avenues, end quote. Now, I want to talk finally about what I consider to be one of the most interesting and fascinating aspects of Totem and Taboo. And I've got it headed here under the heading Freud's Alternative Hypotheses for the Primal Horde. In the concluding pages of Totem and Taboo, Freud introduces two anticipatory arguments in the form of alternative hypotheses, which tended to be ignored in the ensuing controversies between anthropology and psychoanalysis, which centered mainly on this controversial idea of the universal nature of the Oedipus complex. Nowhere is the nuanced nature of Freud's argument and his method of reasoning, proposing his thesis, arguing an antithetical point, arriving at a larger synthesis over and over again. Nowhere is this more evident than in these surprising passages, where Freud, by the way, displays his full awareness of just how speculative he's being. He's aware that Totem and Taboo is the most speculative of all of his writings up to that date. First, Freud acknowledges that the convergence of evidence for his claims does not eliminate, quote, the uncertainties of my premises or the difficulties involved in my conclusions, end quote. Not the least among these uncertainties is Freud's assumption of a, quote, collective mind, in which mental processes occur just as they do in the mind of an individual, end quote. Freud's claim for the continuance of guilt incurred from primeval deeds, long since forgotten, is dependent upon this very assumption of a collective mind, and it begs the question of how this continuance of psychical process could occur in such a way as to transcend the particular individuals of a society. It might be helpful also to keep in mind that he's writing and publishing Totem and Taboo right at the height of his conflict with Carl Jung, who was elaborating his own concept of the collective unconscious. Freud expresses doubt that it can be fully explained by, quote, a direct communication and tradition, end quote. He then proposes a tentative solution in the form of a slightly altered version of Lamarckianism, the evolution by means of acquired characteristics. Quote, the inheritance of psychical dispositions which, however, need to be given some sort of impetus in the life of the individual before they can be roused into actual operation, end quote. Next, Freud postulates a purely experiential psychological explanation for the transgenerational transmission of culture and emotion, completely eliminating the problematic reliance on Lamarckian formulations. So having just postulated his theory of the primal horde based on Lamarckian biogenetic formulations, he now lays out this purely experiential psychological theory for how the events in our prehistory can be carried forward. Quote, we may safely assume that no generation is able to conceal any of its more important mental processes from its successor. For psychoanalysis has shown us that everyone possesses in his unconscious mental activity an apparatus which enables him to interpret other people's reactions, that is, to undo the distortions which other people have imposed on the expression of their feelings. An unconscious understanding, such as this, of all the customs, ceremonies, and dogmas left behind by the original relation to the Father, may have made it possible for later generations to take over their heritage of emotion. Going further then, Freud proposes an alternative version of the Primal Horde based purely on psychic reality, thus rendering his literal account of the primal patricide completely unnecessary. So Freud postulates his theory, his idea that the events of the Primal Horde, where the primal father is murdered by the brothers of the horde, actually took place. Here he's now going to offer a theory that is based purely on psychic reality, that is, the events themselves didn't have to take place, but the dynamic aspect of the fantasies associated with them within the minds of the Primal Horde brothers was sufficient to account for the subsequent events. This is Freud. Quote, "What characterizes neurotics is the fact that they prefer psychical to factual reality and react just as seriously to thoughts as normal persons do to realities. May not the same have been true of primitive men? Accordingly, the mere hostile impulse against the father, the mere existence of a wishful fantasy of killing and devouring him, would have been enough to produce the moral reaction that created totemism and taboo. No damage would thus be done to the causal chain stretching from the beginning to the present day, for psychical reality would be strong enough to bear the weight of these consequences." So this is the quintessential Freud, not backing away from his most controversial claims, but pushing them forward. These passages highlight the central role of the complemental series and the dialectical method in his highly nuanced character of his thesis. Arguably, they also show Freud anticipating, if not laying the foundations for, psychoanalytic theories of intersubjectivity, psychoanalytic literature on the transgenerational transmission of trauma, and finally psychoanalytic theories on the environmental activation of genetic predispositions. But finally, Freud never abandoned his Lamarckianism, nor his stand on which version of the primal events was most likely. In the final passage of Totem and Taboo, with an allusion to the Christian doctrine of original sin, he quotes from Part 1 of Goethe's Faust and provides his famous conclusion to Totem and Taboo. Quote, "Without laying claim to any finality of judgment, I think that in the case before us, it may safely be assumed that, quote, in the beginning was the deed," end quote. Okay, that concludes the lecture. Thank you very much.